call the Marathon County Executive Committee to order, please. We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you. And I open it up to public comment. No one has approached me or the clerk, and I don't believe we have any public joining us on WebEx. So we will move on to item number 4, and that's the approval of the minutes of the December 19th, 2024 Executive Committee meeting. What is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Marash and seconded by Supervisor Drabek. Any discussion on the minutes as presented in the packet? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to approve the minutes of the December 19th, 2024 Executive Committee meeting signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We have 7 members of the Executive Committee in person. We have 1 member of the committee, Ms. Mask, as Supervisor Mask is joining us by WebEx. And we'll move on to policy issues and potential committee determination. We have none. And operational functions required by statute, ordinance, or policy and resolution or policy, we have none. We'll move on to item number 7, educational presentation, committee discussion. So we're looking at item number 7A, discussion of the tax incremental financing legislation changes based on the task force recommendations. And this was on the committee's agenda for last month. We sent out, separately sent out the information that was presented to the task force, and then some recommendations that were in some cases authored by Mr. Pete Weinschenk, and I thank him for that in his interest in this area, and asked for the committee to look at those recommendations and see and what you want to move forward, if any, potential recommendations and or advocacy on possible changes to TIF legislation. I thought it would be the most critical and most important that it start here at the committee, and then we can work it through resolutions if we so desire, and move it on to legislators for advocacy. So I'll open it up for discussion. Supervisor Robinson, please.
So Peter Weinschenk has given us a draft resolution that basically encompasses the 10 guidelines that are in the Department of Revenue's book, and then make some other suggestions. But I'm wondering, we've got 3 committees of jurisdiction sort of dealing with the issue: the Extension, Education, Economic Development from an economic development perspective, HR Finance from the financing perspective, and this committee. And I'm anticipating that this committee's role is looking at what we could do relative to trying to modify state statutes and or policies that might impact TIF development or renewal or expansion in the county. And if that's the case, I think the issues before us would be the composition of the Joint Review Board. Are there 1 or 2 citizen members? What is the extension process, and what is the role of the Joint Review Board in sort of tying or beginning that process? What sort of timeline, standards, and notice requirements are there? And I think there's one that didn't fully come out, but what happens if we've got early success relative determination in the whole issue of donor versus recipient TIFs? And I don't know if we want to take a position on some, all, or none of them, but I think that those are probably the issues based upon the task force. I think we can make the recommendation that they look at those 10 guidelines or those questions and look at trying to do that educational process. We may want to take a stab too at the development of an annual report to the county board relative to the success of the various TIFs in terms of which are performing, which are overperforming, underperforming, in which maybe looking for extensions at some point in time in the future. But I think in just my looking at those recommendations, that seems to be what might be before us today.
So I guess my thought would be that we take those issues, and I think you laid them out, at least initially, well. So do we want to talk about each one of those potentially separately? And we'll start potentially with the composition of the Joint Review Board. I think one of the the way the Joint Review Board is composed of one member for the municipality, one member from the school district, one member from the county, one from the tech college, and then one citizen member. And so I think potentially the task force at least toyed with the idea of one additional county board member and possibly one additional citizen member as a recommendation. And I think one of the things that were incumbent upon that, though, is the ability to have, and there was another one of the advocacy was extending the time the information from the developer or the development agreement comes out. And allow the Joint Review Board to digest that information and get public feedback. I think we've seen that play itself out a little bit in the Rib Mountain area when there was a potential TIF development that I don't know, and I'm not going to weigh in on the merits of the TIF or the positives or the negatives of the TIF, but I think the citizens reacted to the TIF maybe without full information or with full information, or some misunderstandings or misinformation. And I think if there was better timing as far as all of the information that's available is also critical. So what's your thoughts on the composition? Is the composition the right composition? Is there, especially in light of a new requirement that says that the Joint Review Board must set the length of time that a TIF is open? So are we putting the right people on the Joint Review Board to be able to make that informed decision? Thoughts? Supervisor Marash, please.
I'm in favor of adding an additional citizen member and an additional county board member.
So then the question becomes how do we select what selection, because I think we need to answer all of the questions, and that is, how do those individuals get selected and who is the appointing authority? I know possibly the county board would be the approving authority to the board from the board appointment, but the citizen member, I think currently if I'm not mistaken, the Joint Review Board is supposed to be bringing forward the citizen member, the current citizen member, and I don't know how in practice is that happening. I think it's up to each of the municipalities that have TIDs to look for that. But again, I think in some cases we have to get into the minutia to be able to set ourselves up for advocacy the right way. Thoughts? Supervisor Pfiffer, please.
Generally I think that the way that it's laid out currently with one member of each overlying tax jurisdiction and one citizen member is sufficient. If we look at adding one additional county member, is the school district going to want one additional county member or one additional member as well? I think for the most part, their portion of what we're paying in taxes is higher than my county portion of it is. So do they have a additional say in it too? I think it's a slippery slope. I think we're fine with what they are. Each group represents themselves. I think, like I've said before, the county representative has always done a fabulous job of representing the county interests. It is 1 vote of 5 on there. To your point about the public member, I've seen that done in a variety of different ways. I think a lot of joint review boards would benefit from having a little bit better practice on that. Typically, it's recommended, the member's recommended by the municipality. Oftentimes, they're on there for an unlimited term. It doesn't seem that that's looked at on an annual basis or anything. So looking at that, and I think there's ways that that could be cleaned up in terms of process.
Other discussion? Supervisor Robinson?
You know, maybe the better place to start is what criteria are we using to evaluate the creation of the TIFs, and do we have agreement relative to that? I too, you know, when you look at it, well, we are the county board. When we would ask it, I would hazard to guess that out of the 4 taxing entities, the tax burden would be probably 1 would be the municipality, 2nd would be the schools, 3rd would be the county, and 4th would be the technical college. So from the perspective, if you're looking at under $4 per thousand coming from the county in the game, whatever we do has to be approved by the legislature, because these are statutorily prescribed memberships. I think there would be value in having a second objective person. I'm not sure how you do that, but again, it would be dependent upon what criteria are you using and how are you applying it. You know, the but-for argument. Would this development occur but for the use of tax increment financing and other things? So I'm not sure that I'm in a position to say the county should necessarily be there, but I think that the consideration of having another independent person may be there, and then you've got the issue of tie votes. But I think I don't know that many of the TIF, the Joint Review Board meetings or votes have been close.
Right. Supervisor Frick, please.
One of the things in looking at this, have we had any conversations with the counties association or, you know, other entities that are kind of working on legislative issues? In hearing what different legislative agendas are from different associations and groups, I can't say that I've ever heard any conversation about joint review board membership coming up as a hot point. There's conversations about changing the actual modernization of the tax increment bills in terms of maximum allocation, number of extensions, and things like that. Yeah, I just don't want us to sit here and debate this for a long period of time if it's dead on arrival. Obviously, we can vote to make our voices heard on it, but in the, you know, making good use of our time, are we barking up a tree where we're going to be one of 72 counties that's not going to get any get this anywhere? So
I do know you're probably correct in that there was several years ago a senator that was trying to champion some changes to TIF legislation. In fact, I think that one of the results was the requirement that the Joint Review Board set the length of time the TIDs are open. But as far as has there been any discussion, specific to potential membership on the TID the Joint Review Board, I don't believe that exists down at Madison. Not to say that we shouldn't weigh in if we strongly feel that way, but going back to what Supervisor Robinson was mentioning, the amount of tax or the tax district and the tax responsibility of the tax itself. I think the other part of that, though, is that yes, the municipality probably has the largest, or maybe the school district, or two of those are very close, and the county is third, and then the tech is fourth. However, whenever you create an increment in a TID, and that tax is then allowed to be utilized for the improvements in that TID district, the rest of the taxpayers that tax burden is shifted to the rest of the taxpayers. So that's the thing that we need to understand. And so I'm not disagreeing with, that we possibly need to set the criteria. And then are we putting the right people to be able to analyze that criteria on the Joint Review Board? Because I think if we're going to have a requirement that the Joint Review Board, and they are responsible for setting the length of TIDs, I think that's much more critical, because in order to analyze and not just take the recommendations of the developer, be able to analyze the information and look at those 10 questions and criteria. Is this economically beneficial for the county? Is it going to drive the economy? Is it going to drive employment? Those factors, and then if but for. So are we putting people on there with the right credentials to be able to do that analysis work that's required to be able to set that time frame? That's, I think, to me, that seems like the most critical issue. I think we can all agree that tax incremental financing is not going away. There is value to tax incremental financing for economic development tool. There's no question. I think the task force recognizes that. But I think one of the things to me that makes the most, especially in light of the legislation that was changed, are we putting the right people on there to make the determination as to setting length? Because I don't believe that there's any guideposts that the Joint Review Board is required to utilize when setting that length. Other discussion? Other thoughts? Supervisor Drabek, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering, now the school, they get paid by per student, right? So wouldn't, if their area, if they're putting in like some industry or something, then they'll have more people moving into that area. They want more students. And so they're going to automatically vote for this just for the students. And also the tech will do the same thing. Am I correct? So they're not likely to say no. That's what I'm trying to say here.
I don't know that would be 100% accurate. I think because some schools, and I know this was brought up in the Marathon School District, for example, there was a potential large residential development that was potentially going to go into the Marathon School District, and there was then, maybe a little bit after the fact, a discussion with the school board as to what capacity are the facilities at, and what are we potentially asking if there was additional children going to be moving in, because then that was going to be a burden to the current taxpayers and potentially have a potential need for additional facilities. So I think it cuts both ways. If you have a declining enrollment and you have facilities, then probably yes. But if you are at capacity, and some school districts are, some are better at open enrollment than others, and they're filling their schools to capacity already, then maybe that's a bigger issue about saying no. So I think it cuts both ways. But I think it's per district that you'd have to look at that to see whether or not, I don't believe that there'd be an automatic yes by anybody in that case. Now, maybe the tech college possibly, but. Other discussion? Supervisor, please.
Yeah, one of the things in looking at the criteria, and I think the criteria that are presented in the draft resolution are mostly right on par with what I would consider best management practices. The kind of the two at the end that talk about development agreements, the Joint Review Board isn't going to necessarily see every development agreement that's going to be coming through a tax increment district. A lot of times with a redevelopment project or things like that, the agreement may be set, or the district may be set, and if there's not a need for a text amendment or anything like that, they may not see a future development agreement coming forward. I think what's in there, those are best management practices for sure in terms of the guarantees and how the incentives and everything's laid out. But just to be clear, it's not going to be that every time there's a joint review board or a development agreement's being processed, that the joint review board is going to be involved in that review.
No, I think, well, thank you for that, but I think that the joint review board is still, at least on initial creation of a TIF, has got to have the total picture of what the TIF's development's supposed to be and what is there and what's the guarantees. So I don't disagree that each development within that TIF is going to be reviewed by the joint review board. But again, the joint review board is supposed to be setting the length of the TIF to start with, not necessarily be involved in, and should be involved potentially in extensions, but not necessarily the workings during the TIF life, but are supposed to still set the TIF length. Supervisor Robinson.
I think that number 10 comes out of the Department of Revenue guidelines, but what they say is what guarantees are in place to ensure the development will occur as anticipated and the property value will increase as expected. So we might want to look at potentially rewording it. I think I think, let me just walk back in time and I'm going to use Walgreens as an example, because Walgreens would come into communities and say, we have to have a TIF in order to locate, which is, I think, erroneous, because they're locating because of traffic. They would then get the TIF in place to locate there, and then they would use the dark store argument to drive down property values. So the financial viability of the TIF was in jeopardy. I think that and I think in those cases, it would be nice to have a developer agreement in place saying that we're going to guarantee X amount of valuation relative to that project to make sure that you don't go south and have a challenge to the assessed valuation. The problem is developers come and go and, through the life of the TIF, but I think that's where that came from, and I think that's the intent, is to make sure that where you have the opportunity to have guarantees in place, where you've got a ready, willing, and able developer pushing ahead to get those in place and guarantee the valuation jobs or whatever else you might want to put in part of that development agreement.
I think the other thing that happened historically was, in some cases, TIFs were created in certain areas with maybe anticipated developers coming in and developing, but there was nothing to begin with as a foundation for development. And so that's led in some cases to TIFs underperforming or actually upside down TIFs in some cases. So I think that again goes back to what's the guarantees when we're creating TIFs, and what's the guarantees of financial stability and success that we're looking for. Supervisor Frick, please.
Yeah, Chair, you nailed it absolutely. That's one of the things that I think who's ever reviewing these on the county's behalf needs to take into account. The project plan that the Joint Review Board is looking at is really a menu. Infrastructure projects, roads, water, sewer, sidewalks, whatever that may be. It's so important that that's not the first thing that happens, the build it and they will come. That's one of the prime examples in our county of where tax increment district went upside down. Putting in millions and millions of dollars of infrastructure in with the hope that it's going to attract development. Those are the things that we need to instill with our reviewer to make certain that they're following and what they're doing makes financial sense and that the risk tolerance is there.
Right. Other discussion? So I can, as far as the composition, before we leave the composition portion, I can reach out. I mean, if I'm hearing, I don't know that I'm hearing a consensus. I know Supervisor Marash would like to see an expansion of one additional county board member and possibly one additional citizen member. But I also heard, should we reach out to WCA and see if there's any appetite for that kind of change in legislation? I can reach out to WCA and see if there's anybody in the legislature that's willing to champion something like that moving forward before we spend a lot of time on it. But I think, again, going back to what was said earlier, are we putting the right people on there with the right skill sets to be able to do the analysis, and that we're not just putting people on there to populate a joint review board? That would be my critical discussion. So if you want me to do that, I will do that. I'll reach out to WCA and see if there's any, what kind of appetite, if there is, for any TIF legislation, and if there is, what kind of appetite would there be for a composition change. But I think, to some extent, I think you're potentially right. If you're going to add one for county, then you're going to add one for the city, you're going to add one for the school district, you're going to add one, and now you got a 10-person composition of a joint review board. And I don't know that's going to, if we have the right people there, I think is more critical. Other discussion on composition? I think point 2, John, you were bringing up was extension of the joint review board in time for review of the information that's presented on the creation of a TIF and or limiting the extension of TIFs. How do we, I mean, again, I think we have some current legislation that the Joint Review Board is supposed to set length of time. And so how do we ensure that we're not letting the developer just drive especially if that's the initial impetus to create a TIF, are we just allowing the developer to drive the discussion? Or are we actually getting all of the information that the Joint Review Board needs to review? And is it enough time? Because in some cases it comes out a week before the Joint Review Board committee meets, and so there's not in some cases enough time for community feedback, community input, and even the Joint Review Board committee members themselves may not have enough time to review the overall, and then apply the 10 questions, because there inherent in those 10 questions is some significant information that's needed. I mean, will the TIF, one question for you, will the TIF development's economic benefits measured by increased employment, business personal income, and property value compensate the local governments for costs of the improvements? That's a great question, but there's a lot of information that's needed to be able to do that analysis. And just allowing a developer to provide their input, I think doesn't truth test whether that information is accurate and again, get the feedback of the citizens, because the citizens are being asked to pay for that. Thoughts? Supervisor Frederick, please.
I don't mean to take up the conversation, but it's a passion of mine, tax increment financing. One of the things we talk about notices and other things like that, obviously there's statutory requirements in there. Anytime we're putting notices in papers, it's probably an antiquated practice at this point. It's important, getting the actual members that are doing it and getting the actual information to the public more so than reading it in the paper. I I don't know how we go about fixing that process, but I do think that there is benefit in getting that out there. It is available, but you have to know what you're looking for to get it. So I think improving that process would be a positive. I don't have the answer to how you go about doing that, though. One of the things that I'll always advocate for is a third-party analysis of financials. Something that the City of Wausau does, where we use an outside firm and Ellers to review the but-for test with developers, not relying on simply their numbers, because once you typically get into looking at their numbers, there's assumptions made that may not be in the municipality's best interest. Now, I don't know that that's something that is scalable to other communities within the county or in the state, but that's one of the things that I think is very important as part of the review and analysis of development agreements in general.
I think one of the things that I don't know, as you say, the information's available, but it's difficult to probably ascertain. So if there was a requirement that that information be available at least a minimum of 30 days prior to the Joint Review Board meeting, would there necessarily, I mean, the Joint Review Board's a public meeting, so I mean, obviously, anybody can attend a Joint Review Board meeting, and I think we've seen the public attend the Rib Mountain one. But again, I don't know that there's any requirement right now that that information be readily available in one stop shop information for one, the public, and two, the Joint Review Board at a minimum 30 days prior. I think practice probably has been that the meeting gets posted and the packet gets disseminated to the, at least historically, because I've been on notices of some of those. I get it, the municipality may notice me that the meeting is going to be held, but the information is not in that notice itself. So requiring that information be with the notice, I think is critical. Supervisor Robinson?
Well, I think the current statutes and DOR policies call for it being within 45 days, which means it could be, some of those meetings could be 3 days later. For towns, it's 10, not less than 10, nor more than 45. You might want to give more time. Now, I had an opportunity in an earlier life to actually write a TIF plan for the village of Athens, and there are lots of factors, and in that case, we had a transportation economic assistance road grant. We had some other grants that were rolling into it that, and basically the TIF was basically funded after the third tenant in the industrial park, but you didn't know who those tenants were going in. That's one of the unknowns, and SD Ellenbecker was one, Martha Wood Products was another, and Decker Building Supplies was a third that went in and basically funded the TIF. But you don't always know that at the time of the creation, and the community needed a second water tower, which was rolled into that. So I guess the reason I'm raising that is that those discussions sometimes take time, and there ought to be, can we set a minimum or request that there be a minimum of 30 days in order to do the background and due diligence on the part of the other taxing entities to make sure that there's a thorough and effective evaluation of the merits of the case.
I think we can request it. I don't know that, or we could request legislation change that requires it. But yeah, I think it is. I think it's critical. Other discussion? Supervisor Drabeck, please.
Thank you. I guess I just want to say to John here, so you're the one that did that to Athens, huh? No, just kidding.
Did that to Athens.
Yeah, is there any way to put this and print it up so it makes sense to when people get that in the paper or whatever? Because a lot of this stuff, the way it's written, I don't think people really understand it.
Supervisor Fiffick?
I think with the notice requirement in the paper, I don't know that we're ever going to get around that because there's no way you're going to publish a project plan that could be 60 to 100 pages in the newspaper. Nobody from the municipality is going to be able to afford that or want to afford that or pay for it as a taxpayer. But I think having some requirement that the plan be ready and available at that point for viewing, not just, as you mentioned, Chair, that there's going to be a meeting. Because without the actual information to review, how do you prepare for a meeting that you don't know what's going to be presented? So I think there's good value in that.
So if I'm hearing the committee, I think they're wanting a minimum of 30 days as far as information about the TIF prior to the Joint Review Board meeting. Is that at a minimum? And maybe 45 days. Is 45 days putting a bigger burden on the municipality? I'm just playing devil's advocate here. 45 days, is there anything in the current statutes under TIF that would prohibit it, that puts a time limit on the municipality? That either John or Supervisor Pfifferich or Supervisor Robinson, you're currently aware of that? Go ahead.
There's different requirements, and I don't remember the process because every time we look it up, you kind of have to
Follow the
Yep.
steps.
So there's requirements for your local plan commission or redevelopment authority to hold a public hearing. There's typically 2 meetings of the Joint Review Board, one introductory meeting of what the plan's going to be, and then follow-up would be the approval of the Joint Review Board meeting. So I think as long as the 30 days is backdated or would be the end of the actual formal approval, it is a lengthy process. It's a typically 2 months long process, but not that we're extending it too far. Typically there's not a need for anything to happen overnight, but there are certain cases where you have a development and you're competing against other counties, other states that they expect some level of expedited review or quick, timely review. And if we extend it too far, we're going to be overburdening ourselves and putting ourselves at a disadvantage for attracting these businesses.
Okay. So is there a consensus that the information needs to be available to the Joint Review Board a minimum of 30 days before the final decision on the TIF is made? Is that what I'm hearing? I'm seeing some nods, so by consensus, I'm assuming we'll move on then. Requiring reports from our Joint Review Board member on, and I want to be cognizant of the amount of time and effort it is to create a report on all of the TIFs, but there is a requirement for an annual meeting, if I'm not mistaken, of the Joint Review Board. And those are supposed to be held annually, and they're supposed to be providing updates to the Joint Review Board on the progress and the success or lack thereof on each of those TIFs. And so do we want to require our Joint Review Board member to provide an update, at least on an annual basis, of the TIFs and the successes and potentially the ones that are underperforming to the county board, because it's going to require, and monitoring that, it's going to require time of staff, because our staff member that's a representative on the Joint Review Board currently is our finance director, and so. Just reproducing the reports that they receive at the Joint Review Board is one thing, but I think we're looking for something that's, a summary of all the TIFs, or at least a summary of all the TIFs, if we're going to get a handle on, how and what that impact is on the county taxpayer. Thoughts? Supervisor Robinson?
you know, when you look, there's 40 active TIFs, tax increment districts in the county. So our finance director, I think, is attending those, but that doesn't mean that there's 40 separate meetings. What happens typically is the community will have one day where they will review all of them. And for instance, the city of Wausau has 8 active.
Right.
And Schofield has 3, Mosinee has 2, there's 1 in Marshfield that's in Maryland, 2 in Colby, 2 in Abbotsford, 2 in Weston, 1 in Unity, 2 in Stratford, 2 in Spencer, 1 in Rothschild Rib Mountain, 2 in Marathon, 1 in Maine, and 4 in Croninwater, 1 in Hadley, 3 in Edgar, and 2 in Athens. So if you look at each of those communities, the question would be is what would that report look like? You know, when was it created? When is the expiration date? What's the valuation? All of those are things that are generatable through the Department of Revenue's website. You've got, current, I just pulled some information, resolution date, maximum life, extended on a certain date, base year, and you can pull valuation in there. So I don't know that it would be a significant work burden if we know how to grab that information from the Department of Revenue websites, but they're going to do a lot of that work for us. So I think as long as we don't ask them to opine as to whether it's effective, if we can just stick with the reporting, I think that would be beneficial.
Okay. Supervisor Pfeffer, please.
I'd agree with Supervisor Robinson. I think keeping it at a more simple level, especially to begin with, collecting some of that data, and then being able to provide an update. Did the community do an extension this year? Are they looking at doing an extension? Things that would impact the county. Just some of those things I think would be beneficial to start. I don't want it to be an overburdening task on our staff who's got plenty of other things to do.
But I think it's critical when we start looking at the overall total valuation that's in TIDS. When you talk about the county's portion of tax levy that's in TIDS is over $5 million already. So it is effectively almost 1/10 of the county's tax levy is being shifted, and the burden is being shared by the rest of the taxpayers outside the TID. Supervisor Longenhahn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I get various emails from the Department of Revenue with different updates, and one that sticks out in my head is that there is an annual report that I think the municipalities that have TIDs have to file with the Department of Revenue, and I'd look to Supervisor Pfeiffer or Supervisor Robinson's for a little bit more information as far as what's contained on that report. But one way I think to simplify this and to not overburden any of our staff is just to ask the municipality to submit that report to the county as well as the Department of Revenue.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Supervisor Pfeffer, please.
Yeah, just to follow up on that thought, though, I think the deadline for that is July 1, or it also has some potential audit requirements depending on when your audit happened. Usually that information is very basic, and typically I would say for most municipalities that I can think of, that's what's submitted as part of their Joint Review Board annual meeting. So that information is submitted to the county. Frankly, it's not in the best format that everyday folks would be able to read it and see what's happening. So I think doing a summary of it or just simplifying it down to the basics of district, what kind of district it is, year it was created, any extensions, what the valuation of, some of that information in there, I think would be beneficial for us to see on an annual basis and hopefully not overburden staff.
And I think critical upon that is the expected close date and whether or not there's any kind of discussions. Is it a donor TID? Is it being contemplated on an extension on that TID? Supervisor Longenhahn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and a follow-up to that. So I guess this would be a question for Supervisor Pfeiffer. Then what is actually provided to the Department of Revenue as part of that report in July? Because you mentioned something about audits. Are those not, I'm guessing those wouldn't be final numbers that are submitted to the Department of Revenue for those reports? Or what is the word, or how does auditing play into this? I'm curious.
Well, I get the end numbers, so I don't know. I believe that is the audited numbers that they're submitting,
Okay.
but I'm not certain of that. That's
Yeah,
just
it's
my
fine. I
understanding.
don't expect you to speak on behalf of all tax incremental financing.
But I believe what happens is the financials of the TIF district, debt service, expenditures, are audited to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements of where those expenses are paid, and loans, and if there's any loans that are made to the municipality, if there's loans made to other TIFs, I think that's all spelled out in that report.
And to clarify, I was just curious whether or not those reports contain those final numbers. That's why I ask.
Okay. Yep. Other discussion? Other items on that, on the TIF, potential TIF legislation? Supervisor Schifrin.
I'll throw one up that we haven't talked about yet and see if anybody, what folks think of this. But right now, there's an affordable housing extension that a municipality can request when they're getting to the completion of the district's life. Either it's the natural life or they're ready to close it out early. Currently, the maximum allowance on that is 1 year. So, and that money is then collected and has to be used for affordable housing within the community. So whatever you have in terms of increment that last year, that can be set aside. The TIF's open 1 additional year. There has been discussion, it's going to be introduced as part of legislation this year about the possibility of extending that to 2 years or 3 years or something like that. We've talked about at our triple EDC meeting about how the county plays a role in affordable housing. That might be an opportunity for us to advocate on behalf of that extension to be able to allow the municipalities to have some additional money that they can attack that. County would be playing a role, obviously, as they're foregoing collecting some of that money. But just throwing that out there as a conversation possibility.
Discussion. Supervisor Robinson?
I think that would be a great issue for EEDC to weigh in on, from the perspective of that's sort of within their purview. And I would maybe request that they do that.
Does the potential legislation, and I know it's probably difficult to say because it may not be written yet, but is it contemplated that the Joint Review Board would have any role in that that housing component of TIF?
I don't think anything's been drafted yet.
Supervisor Longenon, please.
So I would just say that that's sort of going in the opposite direction of where I'd like to see TIF financing going. I think if anything, there needs to be incentives created at the state level to encourage the closure of these TIDs faster than 20 years. I'm fine if the discussion happens at EEDC. That's fine if there's a healthy discussion. They figure out whether or not they want to support something like that and what the county's role is with affordable housing. But I would just say my knee-jerk reaction is that's the opposite of where I'd like to see things going.
Well, I clearly think it's a option or an expansion of use of TID money currently that's not authorized. And so it's an expansion of TID of use. But I think everybody recognizes that the housing is an issue when the median individuals in households continues to decline, and people continue to stay in their houses longer. The need for additional housing and affordable and workforce housing is critical. And we just seen from Forward Analytics today a report that showed that the number of 18-year-olds in Marathon County from 2020 to 2023 decreased by 7.9%. And impacts that has on schools and potential workforce. In the future, the tool that Forward Analytics sent out had you could click on any county and find out what that population has done. It was really interesting that I think there was 6 or 7 counties where that population had increased, but the rest of the state was all decreases, and pretty much all of our neighboring counties, other than Clark County, were decreasing, and some of them significant, some of them in the 40% category during that same time period. I think Langlade County was close into the 40% decrease in that 18-year-old or under population. What that impact has, and how do we change and stem that tide? Because as we all know, we're getting older, and the need for additional workers is critical. Other Supervisor Pfiffer, please.
Yeah, just in response to Supervisor Longenhahn's question about incentives, with Act 12, 2023, which took effect in October 1 of 24 now, they did create a incentive that deals with allowable tax levy increases. So, and this deals with if you close a TID within 75% or less of its expected life, there's adjustments that make it more beneficial for a municipality to close out early. Now, I don't know if that's a big enough incentive that how much traction that's going to get, but there has been some action on that. It would be nice to see more benefits for closing out tax districts early, but that's one small thing I'll point out.
Supervisor Longenhahn, please.
Thank you. Is that an adjustment to the allowable levy of the municipality, or how does that work?
I believe it's the municipality.
All right, thank you.
Other discussion? Other items that you want to see on possible legislation? Okay, Supervisor Robinson, please.
And this is more for enlightenment. I know that the Joint Review Board is supposed to set the life of the TIF, but what is the role of the Joint Review Board relative to extensions? I think what happens historically is the community goes to the legislature, asks for a change to either increase the equalized valuation or the life of the TIF through legislation, and the Joint Review Board isn't consulted. And I know you can't bind a future legislature, but is there a way to build a mechanism in that prior to a request to extend the life of a TIF would require notification to the Joint Review Board participants?
I think I would even go one step further, John. I think you would have to have consent from the Joint Review. I mean, if the Joint Review Board is setting effectively, currently under current legislation, setting the time limit, extensions should have the consent of the Joint Review Board prior to even any legislation being offered. That just, to me, I mean, if we're going to put some teeth into the Joint Review Board's authority to set that time frame, I think holding municipalities accountable to that time frame. Now, obviously, many things change, over potentially the life of the TIF, but that's what you have the Joint Review Board does. So can we? I don't know that that's there or not. I guess I would. I don't know if the Joint Review Board is required to consent to extensions. Supervisor?
It depends on the type of extension. A standard or tech college extension, the Joint Review Board is required to approve the resolution as part of, in order for that extension to take place. Affordable housing is done at the municipal level.
Okay. But there again, I think the requirement to provide that information to the Joint Review Board, again, in advance for review 30 days prior to be able to make an informed decision as to the extension and the need for it is critical. Supervisor Longenhahn? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with doing some quick research on the Department of Revenue's website in relation to the Act 12 reference that Supervisor Pfeiffer made. I'm reading a section here. It says TID termination for levy limits, beginning with TIDs created in 2025, allows a one-time levy adjustment equal to 10% of the newly created value within the TID. The adjustment may be increased to 25% if the TID closes prior to 75% of its anticipated life. So there was an incentive created, but it's only for the TIDs created in 2025 forward. So all those existing ones, there's no incentive to close those at the moment. Also, it's interesting that 10% jump, the way I view that is that the municipality gets the benefit of the increased tax base plus that 10%. The overlying taxing jurisdictions, the county, the school district, and the tech, they only get the increased value of that increment for their benefit. So it's interesting that the municipality gets the 10%, but the rest of the taxing jurisdictions don't. But maybe that plays into the incentive for the municipality to close the TID. I don't know. So just some thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Robinson.
And again, I think this is an issue jointly with EEDC relative to, I think we would request that the Joint Review Board take a deliberate and thorough evaluation of those 10 criteria that are spelled out in the Department of Revenue guidelines and embodied in Peter's proposed resolution. And as a standard operating procedure, just to make sure that they are indeed done. There's a statutory, some of those are imposed through the statutes, some of the but-for argument, and some of the other ones are actually statutorily captured then in the Department of Revenue criteria. But I think that we would want all of them to be evaluated at the time of creation.
I guess I would look to the chair for EEDC to be looking at those. And I know she had mentioned, Supervisor Marash, the chair, had mentioned that their committee would be working on some of the criteria for some of those questions in the future. So, okay, other items under legislation potentials. Other thoughts? Any other thoughts? Okay, we will move on to item number 7B, update from the administrator's 2024 completed work plan. I'll turn it over to the administrator for a brief review.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, unless there are questions on the 2024 work plan update, I previously provided that at one of your meetings, and it's again in your packet. Really, the next step per your board rules is really putting together that 2025 proposed work plan, and following the process that we utilized last year, I put just a brief summary. I'm not going through with the progress because, again, I think that the guidance I much prefer to get from the committee, this committee, is really what does that prioritization look like? There are more things on that work plan. It's always fun. I think the word that was used before was people are passionate about TIF. I think Supervisor Pfeiffer referenced that. I'm really passionate about work plans. But I tried to put together all the things that you've talked about. And one thing I added this year in the summary that's in your packet for 2025 is really trying to at least just highlight where some of these items are coming from. So you'll see for a couple of things that whether it's an HR finance and property directive or a extension education economic development directive or a homelessness task force directive, I tried to put some of that in there for flavor to see where these things are coming from. But my ask of you, I think, and I talked with the chair before this, the ask of the committee is take a look at those items. Certainly if you have questions, I can try to answer those today as to where they kind of originated. But then take that information and try to prioritize it, and how deep you go in prioritization is certainly something for this committee to talk about. I included some operational priorities on there just to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that I need to do just to, for lack of a better term, keep the wheels on the bus. I highlighted under section 2A, onboarding new department heads and key staff. That is just something we got to do, and we have to. I'll be very transparent with you. I need to do a better job of that and devote more time to it. But we have some really key positions that are going to be coming on board in the next couple of months, or that have already come on board. The veteran service. Currently, we have an interim veteran service officer. Aaron Galindo is in that position. Jill Jeffroy, who was with us for just shy of 5 years, moved on. That was a planned transition, so we had a little bit of time to put in place Mr. Galindo in that interim role, and we'll proceed with that position and onboarding him, and then making an ultimate determination about the long-term appointment there. But Register of Deeds, we have a new Register of Deeds, Jenny Lemmer, who was introduced to HR Finance and Property yesterday. We have a new district attorney. He's not new to the office, been an attorney for quite a number of years. But similar to Ms. Lemmer, who's been with the county for a number of years, there's an onboarding process about, hey, what are the county policies that we need to work through, and what are my expectation of department heads? Because largely they're very similar, whether you're appointed or whether you're elected, and certainly they need to run an office, and I want to make sure I can provide all assistance to them to do that effectively. We're going to make a big transition relative to the Regional Forensic Science Center, so we'll have a chief medical examiner, a forensic pathologist is going to be running, a physician is going to be running that office. The economic development professional that we've talked about, I have an admin assistant that I need to onboard. So there's a lot of things, and I skipped over facilities and capital management. There's just a lot of that stuff that we need to do. And I won't go through the rest of the operational pieces, but just to give you a little bit of the flavor again of just the wheels on the bus stuff that needs to happen for our organization, while you also then consider some of the priorities that you have in those other areas that I've largely kept the organization the same in terms of what's facilities related. I merged budget and finance related projects together. But I won't go through everything. I'll be happy to answer questions. But as always, there's much more things of interest to do than time and energy to get them all done. That said, we'll certainly try to, from the staff side, I'll try to delegate those out and monitor progress, because again, the work plan isn't really just me doing things. I don't want to give that impression at all. It's how do I marshal as much progress as possible with the team that we have. But as I make some of those resource allocation decisions, it's really helpful if I have guidance. Like if something is truly important to the county board, and particularly this committee to start, it really helps me know that. When, hey, this is number one, or this is one of my top couple of things to get done. That doesn't mean I'll be able to get it done, but if it helps me to kind of understand that, because all these things, make no mistake, from my perspective, they all have value. And I think the board and all your committees have had discussions that, again, are valuable. It's just, I need to know what is the priority, because we certainly can't do everything all at once. So I'm happy to answer questions, but I think in speaking with you, Mr. Chair, I think the next step is for this committee to go through and then have a prioritization discussion.
Yeah, so I thank the administrator for putting this together. I think this is a list that he produced based on ongoing projects, ongoing operations, discussions with various committees, discussions that and projects that are in play, and then in some cases added in some operational issues. I guess the two questions that I would have for the executive committee: is there anything that you know as chairs of your standing committees that is not on the work plan or on the proposed list of work plan? And then the second thing will be homework for the executive committee, and that is, we need to prioritize this. I mean, I'm not going to sit there and say any one item is we have to prioritize because I don't believe that everything is important on there, but if everything is number one, then nothing is number one, especially with the exhaustive list that we have here. So I'm going to saddle each member with requirement that they prioritize each of the 5 areas that are on there and prioritize them, and then provide that feedback to me so I can provide a summary as we did last term, and provide that summary to the administrator so that he knows which is at least the executive committee's top priority. What's the number 2? If time becomes we can only require our administrator to work 24 hours a day, 5 days a week. We can't make him work on the weekends. But so my point to it is, there is limited time that the administrator has to special projects. With my involvement and in the courthouse, probably at least 3 to 4 days out of the week. I know how busy he is just keeping as he says, the lights on. But he tries to get to every project, and some of this he delegates to other individuals. But again, I think if we are the executive committee and the chairs of each of the standing committees, I think it is incumbent upon us to what do we see as the number 1 priority for the county moving forward. So first question, is there anything that's critically that you see that's missing from the list of projects or list of items on the work plan? Supervisor Robinson.
Some of this may be more embellishment or others, but I think some of the things that I think we need to keep an eye on is that whole issue of ARPA expenditure. Now that we've encumbered the dollars, we still have to make sure that we have spent them by December 31st of next year. And if we don't use it, we lose it. So I would somehow, administrative, we should do that. One of the items that you talked about in this year's work plan was the whole issue of the purchasing policy and some of the accountability and the review sign off on the contracts by the Corp Council Finance and others. I guess I have a concern relative to the Forensic Science Center in the context of developing a revenue side to make sure that I think it's inherent in there, but I just want to make sure that it's there as we look at trying to get partnerships in place with other counties to make sure that we've got the stream as we begin to hire the medical examiner, and that you've already made one hire or have a person on board, but we need to make sure that that's going to cash flow for the county or minimize the subsidy of it by strengthening the relationships with other parties. You talked about Workday, but in your notes on this year, you talked about adaptive software and the limitations from a budgeting perspective. Again, just making that may be more nitpicky, but to make sure that we're in line on that issue. And then just a point that we did put into the budget funding for limited term employment for dealing with some of the housing, surplus property, and economic development issues, and just want to make sure that we do that. And I would ask for clarification on when you want us to rank the projects. Are you looking at facilities, operational priorities, budget finance priorities, or within those A through E others? Because one of my top priorities is make sure that we get the deputy administrator back as a deputy administrator and an administrative assistant in place to help the administrator perform those tasks. And I might not list the entire project area as a priority, but I think that has to be one of the key top priorities to ease your workload and also be of value to the county board moving ahead.
So to thank you for that great input. I think two things. I would say we want to prioritize within each of the subcategories first, and then once you're done with that, then I would say provide the top 5 items that you want. So there may be 4 items or out of operation priorities and projects that you see above any other facilities items. So even though you ranked items A through E in facilities and you prioritize those in the order that you want them, your first 5 priorities have nothing to do with facilities. So I guess what I'm looking for is prioritize in the subgroups and then give me the top 5 items that you see from any of the subgroups as a separate list. Does that make sense? Okay. Supervisor Fibrick.
Is there a way that we can utilize some type of software where it can be a drop down, one of those? I've seen a number of different
I'm
things.
hoping to be able to utilize a tool that you'd be able to move, and it moves those items. So I'll get that out in a separate email, but I just wanted to have it here for discussion and any other thoughts or feedback from the executive committee first. Supervisor Drabek, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been looking through this and I didn't see anything from solid waste or about solid waste. I think they're still doing building out there. Is that considered, do you consider that done? That's not something that we're still on the work plan? Just wondering how that works.
Talking about the oversight of the RNG plant?
No, that's certainly something that is ongoing. In fact, I think the big thing on the horizon relative to solid waste, apart from just the general financial management, which again is ongoing, specifically the issue of leachate management, because that is going to substantially impact solid waste and the county. So I can add, I think that's good feedback. I'll add that as an item, Mr. Chair, if that's okay with
Yep.
everyone, to work on an item in my mind that probably fits under budget and finance related projects, because solid waste management as an enterprise, quasi-enterprise fund, there are a couple of issues that really are underneath that. Like I just said, leachate management. Yesterday, HR Finance and Property talked about pollution liability funding and whether our strategy is insurance-based, reserve-based, or a combination of those two. So I'll craft an item and put that in that area, and then we can send that out for ranking.
I think it's also critical to the financial success of the solid waste department, RNG plant coming online and potentially receiving a dividend revenue from the facility once it goes operational. Supervisor Robinson?
So as we're talking about enterprise accounts, I think there's a future concern relative to the airport and their use of reserves for operational functions. And I just think sooner than later, we need to begin to do an evaluation of the sustainability based upon the present structure and funding sources of the airport, because I think they're drawing them down. We haven't had the passenger employment fees in other things there, but I think it begs for either this year or early next year beginning that discussion about where we're going with the airport, so it doesn't sneak up on us all of a sudden.
I wouldn't disagree. I do think in talking, I had talked to the airport director about that specific thing, and I think, John, you might even been part of that conversation when we had the joint airport board meeting and HR Finance Committee meeting, looking at their budget. Part of the spend down of reserves was a plan, but that plan's not sustainable if we don't turn around the employments, because then at some point they may be coming to the county for levy to assist in operations. Obviously, it's a multi-county entity, but you're 100% correct. Any other discussion items on the 2025 work plan and prioritization that I will ask the executive committee to do? Okay. Anything additional, Administrator Leonard?
No, thank you very much. We'll make those couple of additions for you to rank, and then I will begin to structure that into a format consistent with what you've seen in the past.
Okay, we'll move on to item number D, and that's discussion about the administrator's eval. I know in our board rules, it says that we are to do the administrator, well, first off, in the odd numbered years, we are to do the eval of the administrator. The executive committee is to do the eval of the administrator. In the even number of years, we are to poll the full board and get their feedback also. So this year, it is the executive committee's responsibility. I did ask, and the Corp Counsel, Mike Purner, did send out on my behalf an email that included the administrator's evaluation. So I'm asking that at some point you fill out that evaluation and submit that back either to myself or to Mr. Purner. He will be the one that does the summary of the evaluation, and then we will have a closed session discussion with the eval, with those evaluation criteria brought in and summarized in February. So I just wanted to put it on the agenda today to give you that heads up that I didn't expect you to get that eval done and resubmitted to do a closed session review of that document for January, but we will be doing that in February because it was my bad in not getting that out to you sooner. So it's now should be in your inbox from Mr. Purner on my behalf, and so any questions on that, you can direct them either to me or Mike. So if we could have those back by the 1st of February, again, I think that'll allow time for Mike and myself to do the summary, and we'll provide that summary in closed session, do a review of that summary, and then finalize a report for the administrator's evaluation. Questions? All right. Committee members are asked to bring items for future discussion. And the next committee meeting is scheduled for February 13th at 3 p.m. Anything else to come before the committee? Seeing that, we're down to item number 9. What is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Drabek, second by Supervisor Arstead. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Aye. We stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.